Hare Krishna. Let's start with Hare Krishna Maha Mantra. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Ram, Ram Ram, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Ram, Ram Ram, Hare Hare. We are reading Bhagwat Geeta as it is by His Divine Grace A.C. Bhakti Vedant Swami Prabhupada, founder Acharya of the International Society for Krishna Consciousness. Yesterday we got cut at I think text 38. So let's repeat the text 38 of chapter 3. As fire is covered by smoke, as a mirror is covered by dust, or as the embryo is covered by the womb, the living entity is similarly covered by different degrees of this lust. Let's read the purport. There are 3 degrees of covering of the living entity by which his pure consciousness is obscured. This covering is but lust under different manifestations like smoke in the fire, dust on the mirror, and the womb about the embryo. When lust is compared to smoke, it is understood that the fire of the living spark can be a little perceived. In other words, when the living entity exhibits his Krishna consciousness slightly, he may be likened to the fire covered by smoke. Although fire is necessary where there is smoke, there is no overt manifestation of fire in the early stage. This stage is like the beginning of Krishna consciousness. The dust on the mirror refers to a cleansing process of the mirror of the mind by so many spiritual methods. The best process is to chant the holy names of the Lord. The embryo covered by the womb is an analogy illustrating a helpless position, for the child in the womb is so helpless that he cannot even move. This stage of living condition can be compared to that of the trees. The trees are also living entities, but they have been put in such a condition of life by such a great exhibition of lust that there are almost void, that they are almost void of all the consciousness. The covered mirror is compared to the birds and beasts, and the smoked covered fire is compared to the human being. In the form of a human being, the living entity may revive a little Krishna consciousness, and if he makes further development, the fire of the spiritual life can be kindled in the human form of life. By careful handling of the smoke in the fire, fire can be made to blaze. Therefore, the human form of life is a chance for the living entity to escape the entanglement of material existence. In the human form of life, one can conquer the enemy lust by cultivation of Krishna consciousness under able guidance. Let's read text 39. Thus the wise living entity's pure consciousness becomes covered by his eternal enemy in the form of lust, which is never satisfied and which burns like fire. Let's read the purport. It is said in the Manusmriti that lust cannot be satisfied by any amount of sense enjoyment, just as fire is never extinguished by a constant supply of fuel. In the material world, the center of all activities is sex, and thus this material world is called Maithunya Agara, or the shackles of sex life. In the ordinary prison house, criminals are kept within bars. Similarly, the criminals who are disobedient to the laws of the Lord are shackled by sex lives. Advancement of material civilization on the basis of sense gratification means increasing the duration of the material existence of the living entity. Therefore, this lust is the symbol of ignorance by which the living entity is kept within the material world. While one enjoys sense gratification, it may be that there is some feeling of happiness, but actually, that so called feeling of happiness is the ultimate enemy of the sense enjoyer. Let's go to text 40. The senses, the mind, and the intelligence are the sitting places of this lust. Yes. So lust sits in the senses, in the mind, and in the intelligence. Through them, lust covers the real knowledge of the living entity and bewilders him. Let's read the purport. The enemy has captured different strategic positions in the body of the conditioned soul, and therefore Lord Krishna is giving hints of those places so that one who wants to conquer the enemy may know where he can be found. Mind is the center of all the activities of senses, and thus, when we hear about sense objects, the mind generally becomes a reservoir of all ideas of sense gratification. And as a result, the mind and the senses become repositories of lust. Next, the intelligence department becomes the capital of such lustful propensities. Intelligence is the immediate next door neighbor of the spirit soul. Lusty intelligence influences the spirit soul to acquire the false ego and identify itself with matter and thus with the mind and senses. The spirit soul becomes addicted to enjoying the material senses and mistakes this as a true happiness. This false identification of the spirit soul is very nicely explained in Srimad Bhagavatam. It's in quotes. A human being who identifies this body made of three elements with his self, who considers the byproducts of the body to be his kinsmen, and who considers the land of birth worshipable, and who goes to the place of pilgrimage simply to take a bath rather than meet men of transcendental knowledge there, is to be considered like an ass or a cow. Let's go to text 41. Therefore, O Arjun, best of the Bharats in the very beginning, best of the Bharats in the very beginning curb this great symbol of sin, which is lust, by regulating the senses and slay this destroyer of knowledge and self-realization. Right? Let's read the purport. The Lord advised Arjun to regulate the senses from the very beginning so that he could curb the greatest sinful enemy, which is lust, which destroys the urge for self-realization and self-specific knowledge of the self. Jnana refers to knowledge of self as distinguished from non-self, or in other words, knowledge that the spirit soul is not the body. Vijnana refers to specific knowledge of the spirit soul's constitutional position and his relationship to Supreme Soul. It is explained thus in Srimad Bhagavatam 2.9.31 that the knowledge of the self and supreme self is very confidential and mysterious, but such knowledge and specific realization can be understood if explained with their various aspects by the Lord Himself. Bhagwat Geeta gives us that general and specific knowledge of the self. The living entities are parts and parcels of the Lord, and therefore they are simply meant to serve the Lord. This consciousness is called Krishna consciousness. So, from the very beginning of life, one has to learn this Krishna consciousness, and thereby one may become fully Krishna conscious and act accordingly. Lust is only the perverted reflection of the love of God, which is natural for every living entity. But if one is educated in Krishna consciousness from the very beginning, that natural love of God cannot deteriorate into lust. When love of God deteriorates into lust, it is very difficult to return to the normal condition. Nonetheless, Krishna consciousness is so powerful that even a late beginner can become lover of God by following the regulative principles of devotional service. So, from any stage of life or from the time of understanding its urgency, one can begin regulating the senses in Krishna consciousness, devotional service of the Lord, and turn the lust into love of Godhead, the highest perfectional stage of human life. So beautiful. Let's read text 42. The working senses are superior to dull matter. Mind is higher than the senses. Yeah. Intelligence is still higher than the mind. And he, the soul, is even higher than the intelligence. So we have got one chronology. So we have working senses, we have mind, we have intelligence, and finally we have the soul. Let's read the purport. The senses are different outlets for the activities of lust. Yes. Lust is reserved within the body, but it is given vent through the senses. Therefore, the senses are superior to the body as a whole. These outlets are not in use when there is superior consciousness or Krishna consciousness. In Krishna consciousness, the soul makes direct connection with the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Therefore, the hierarchy of bodily functions, as described here, ultimately ends in the Supreme Soul. Bodily action means functions of the senses, and stopping the senses means stopping all bodily actions. But since the mind is active, then even though the body may be silent and at rest, the mind will act as it does during dreaming. Okay, let me read this again. Bodily action means functions of the senses, and stopping the senses means stopping all bodily functions. But since mind is active, then even though the body may be silent and at rest, the mind will act as it does during dreaming. But above the mind is the determination of the intelligence, and above the intelligence is the soul proper. If therefore the soul is directly engaged with the Supreme, naturally all other subordinates, namely the intelligence, mind, and senses, will be automatically engaged. In the Katha Upanishad, there is a similar passage in which it is said that the objects of sense gratification are superior to the senses and mind is superior to the sense objects. If therefore the mind is directly engaged in the service of the Lord constantly, then there is no chance that the senses will become engaged in other ways. This mental attitude has already been explained. Yes. Param draštva nirvartate. Nirvartate. If the mind is engaged in the transcendental service of the Lord, there is no chance of its being engaged in the lower propensities. In the Katha Upanishad, the soul has been described as Mahan, the great. Therefore, the soul is above all, namely the sense objects, the senses, the sense objects, that is the body parts, I feel, the senses, the feeling that we get through these body parts, the mind, and the intelligence. Therefore, directly understanding the constitutional position of the soul is the solution of the whole problem. Right. With intelligence, one has to seek out the constitutional position of the soul and then engage the mind always in Krishna consciousness. That solves the whole problem. A neophyte spiritualist is generally advised to keep aloof from the objects of the senses. But aside from that, one has to strengthen the mind by use of intelligence. If by intelligence one engages one's mind in Krishna consciousness, by complete surrender onto the Supreme Personality of Godhead, then automatically the mind becomes stronger. And even though the senses are very strong, like serpents, they will be no more effective. They will be no more effective than serpents with broken fangs. Right. I love the analogy that they make with serpents and the senses, the lust. But even though the soul is the master of intelligence and mind, and the senses also, still, unless it is strengthened by association with Krishna, in Krishna consciousness, there is every chance of falling down due to the agitated mind. This was very interesting. Let's go to text 43. Thus, knowing oneself to be transcendental to the material senses, mind, and intelligence, O mighty armed Arjun, one should steady the mind by deliberate spiritual intelligence, that is Krishna consciousness, and thus, by spiritual strength, conquer this insatiable enemy known as lust. Let's read the purport. This third chapter of the Bhagwat Geeta is conclusively directive to Krishna consciousness by knowing oneself as the eternal servitor of the Supreme Personality of Godhead without considering impersonal voidness the ultimate end. In the material existence of life, one is certainly influenced by propensities for lust and desire for dominating the resources of material nature. Desire for overloading, and for sense gratification is the greatest enemy of the conditioned soul. Yes, but by the strength of Krishna consciousness, one can control the material senses, the mind, and the intelligence. So I have learned that there are many desires, right? When you want something and when you are not able to get it or you're not able to reach out to it, I just try, and if it doesn't happen, then I just take it as a sign that, okay, this is something that Krishna is trying to teach me, and I have to wait and let it happen if it has to happen and be okay with it. So when I come to Krishna consciousness and I surrender that, okay, Krishna, whatever you feel, you, whatever is right for me, you give me. And immediately there is a lift of, I don't know, so many feelings, so many so much of anxiousness or so much of pressure. There is a lift, and suddenly you feel light and you feel confident and faithful. So that is a very good feeling and a very progressive mindset. One may not give up work and prescribed duties all of a sudden, but by gradually developing Krishna consciousness, one can be situated in a transcendental position without being influenced by the material senses and the mind, by steady intelligence directed towards one's pure identity. This is the sum total of this chapter. In the immature stage of material existence, philosophical speculations and artificial attempts to control the senses by the so called practice of yoga postures can never help a man towards spiritual life. Sorry. He must be trained in Krishna consciousness by higher intelligence. Thus end the Bhagavad Bhakti Vedant purports to the third chapter of the Srimad Bhagwat Gita in the matter of Karma Yoga, or the discharge of one's prescribed duty in Krishna consciousness. So we successfully finished the third chapter, and now we are starting the chapter 4. The chapter 4 title is Transcendental Knowledge. Okay. Text 1. Lord Krishna is saying, the personality of Godhead, Lord Sri Krishna, said, I instructed this imperishable science of yoga to the sun god Vivaswan, and Vivaswan instructed it to Manu, the father of mankind, and Manu in turn instructed it to Ikshvaku. Okay, let's let's introduce ourselves to the origin of the origin. Okay, let's read the purport. Herein we find the history of Bhagwat Gita traced from a remote time when it was delivered to the royal order of all planets, beginning from the sun planet. The kings of all planets are especially meant for the protection of the inhabitants, and therefore the royal order should understand the science of Bhagavad Gita in order to be able to rule the citizens and protect them from material bondage to lust. Human life is meant for cultivation of spiritual knowledge in eternal relationships with the Supreme Personality of Godhead, and the executive heads of all states and all planets are obliged to impart this lesson to the citizens by education, culture, and devotion. In other words, the executive heads of all states are intended to spread the science of Krishna consciousness so that the people may take advantage of this great science and pursue a successful path utilizing the opportunity of the human form of life. Right. In this millennium, the sun god is known as Vivaswan, Vivaswan, the king of the sun, which is the origin of all planets within the solar system. In Brahma Samhita 5.52, it is stated, let me worship, Lord Brahma said. Let me worship the Supreme Personality of Godhead Govinda, Krishna, who is original person and under whose order the sun, which is the king of all planets, is assuming immense power and heat. The sun represents the eyes of the Lord and traverses its orbit in obedience to his order. The sun is the king of the planets, and the sun god at present of the name Vivashwan rules the sun planet, which is controlling all other planets by supplying heat and light. He is rotating under the order of Krishna, and Lord Krishna originally made Vivashwan his first disciple to understand the science of Bhagavad Gita. The Gita is not, therefore, a speculative treatise for the insignificant mundane scholar, but it is the standard of book of knowledge coming down from time immemorial. In the Mahabharata, Shanti Parva 348.51 and 52, we can trace out the history of the Gita as follows. In the beginning of the millennium known as Treta Yuga, this science of the relationship with Supreme was delivered by Vivashwan to Manu. Manu, being father of mankind, gave it to his son Maharaja Ikshvaku, Ikshvaku, the king of this earth planet and forefather of the Raghu dynasty in which Lord Ramchandra appeared. Therefore, Bhagavad Gita existed in human society from the time of Maharaja Ikshwaku. At the present moment, we have just passed through 5,000 years of Kali Yuga, which lasts 4,32,000 years. Before this, there was Dwapar Yuga, which was 8 lakh years, and before that, there was Treta Yuga, which was 1.2 million years. Thus, some 2,005,000 years ago, Manu spoke the Bhagwat Geeta to his disciple and son Maharaja Ishwaku, the king of this planet. The age of the current Manu is calculated to last some, oh my god, this number I can't even tell, 305 lakh, 305 crore 3 lakh. 3 crore, I can't even know. 3 crore it is 30 crore 53 lakh years, of which 12 crore 4 lakh have passed, right? Accepting that before the birth of Manu, the Gita was spoken by the Lord to his disciple, the sun god Vivashvan. A rough estimate is that the Gita was spoken at least how many years? 1 crore 20 lakh 12 crore 4 lakh years ago. And in human society, it has been extant for 2 million years. It was re-spoken by the Lord again to Arjun about 5,000 years ago. That is the rough estimate of the history of the Gita, according to Gita itself and according to the version of the speaker, Lord Sri Krishna. It was spoken to the sun god Vivashvan because he is also a Kshatriya and is the father of all Kshatriyas who are descendant of the sun god or the Surya Vamsha Kshatriyas. Because Bhagavad Gita is as good as the Vedas, being spoken by the Supreme Personality of Godhead, this knowledge is aparusheya, superhuman. Since the Vedic instructions are accepted as they are, without human interpretation, the Gita must therefore be accepted without mundane interpretation. The mundane wranglers may speculate on the Gita in their own ways, but that is not Bhagavad Gita as it is. Therefore, Bhagavad Gita has to be accepted as it is from the disciplic succession, and it is described herein that the Lord spoke to the sun god, the sun god spoke to his son Manu, and Manu spoke to his son Ishwaku. Let's end here with Hare Krishna Maha Mantra. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Ram, Ram Ram, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Ram, Ram Ram, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Ram, Ram Ram, Hare. Hare Krishna, everyone.